A simple sandwich the waitress Isabella approached. With an almost imperceptible nervousness, she discreetly slid a folded piece of paper under his napkin. What he read on that note left him completely paralyzed. What message could be so dangerous that an employee would risk everything to pass it to a complete stranger? What comes next will shock you. Julian took off the gold Patek Philippe that always adorned his wrist, carefully placing it in his office safe. His designer Italian suit remained hanging in the closet, replaced by a simple shirt and worn-out jeans he had bought that very morning. He looked at himself in the marble bathroom mirror of his mansion in the Garden District, the most exclusive area of New Orleans. The man staring back at him was no longer Julian Devereaux, the magnate who owned the most successful restaurant chain in the southern United States. He was just Julian, an ordinary guy wanting to eat a po' boy. But there was something much deeper to this transformation. He was tired, profoundly exhausted by the fake smiles, the automatic yes sirs, the gazes that only saw dollar signs when they looked at him. He wanted to know what it was like to be treated like a normal person. He wanted to find out if someone could see him for who he really was, not for what he had in the bank. His driver was waiting downstairs with the armored Cadillac Escalade, but Julian walked to the corner and raised his hand to hail a cab. The driver, an older gentleman with a graying mustache, glanced at him in the rearview mirror as they pulled away. "Where to, Chief?" he asked, with that soft southern accent Julian so loved about his hometown. "To the Gilded Lily restaurant, please," he replied, feeling a knot of anticipation in his stomach, as if it were the first time he was visiting his own business. During the ride, he observed the city he loved so much. The sound of jazz floating from the balconies of the French Quarter, the historic buildings blending with modern architecture, the people walking the streets with that characteristic southern warmth. New Orleans was his home, but it had been years since he had truly experienced it as an ordinary citizen, always transported in luxury cars, always entering through back doors, always surrounded by security. Today would be different. Today, he would be free. When the taxi stopped in front of the Gilded Lily, Julian felt his stomach tighten. It was his most cherished restaurant, the first one he had opened 10 years ago, when he still dreamed of honoring Louisiana's Creole cuisine. The aged red brick facade and wrought iron details welcomed him as always, but this time there would be no red carpet, no manager rushing to greet him. He paid the taxi driver with crumpled bills he had saved especially for the occasion, and walked toward the main entrance. His hands trembled slightly as he pushed the glass door. The familiar aroma of fresh bread, seafood, and spices hit him like a nostalgic caress. This place represented everything he loved about his land: tradition, family, food made with love. But it also represented an empire that had distanced him from those very same roots. Customers laughed and chatted at the tables, oblivious to the fact that the owner of it all had just walked in, disguised among them. Marcus Thorne, the restaurant manager, was overseeing the tables when he saw a man enter who made no particular impression on him. He was of average height, tan, with simple clothes and shoes that had seen better days. He didn't even bother to approach him personally. "Maria!" he shouted to one of the hostesses. "Take care of the gentleman at the entrance!" Julian stood waiting by the door, watching as other customers were greeted with more enthusiasm. A well-dressed family arrived right behind him. Immediately, Marcus approached with his best smile, greeted them effusively, and escorted them to a table by the window overlooking the patio. Julian clenched his fists in his pockets. It was exactly as he had suspected. In his own restaurant, which he had built on the philosophy that all customers deserved the same respect, distinctions were being made based on appearance. Maria finally arrived with a poorly disguised expression of boredom. "Table for how many?" she asked, without even looking him in the eye. "For one, please," Julian replied, trying to remain calm. The table he was assigned was in the most forgotten corner of the restaurant, next to the kitchen door, where the clatter of dishes and the constant coming and going of staff disrupted any sense of peace. It had no view of the inner garden he had personally designed, nor was it near the musicians playing live jazz. It was the kind of table where they put customers they considered less important. Julian sat down in the metal chair that creaked under his weight and picked up the menu with hands that no longer trembled from nervousness but from restrained indignation. All of this was his. Every chair, every plate, every ingredient in the kitchen. He had invested not only millions of dollars, but also his heart and soul to create a place where people could feel at home. And now, disguised as an ordinary customer, he was discovering that this dream had become a nightmare of discrimination and classism. He read the menu he knew by heart, wondering how many other customers had been treated this way. How many people had come seeking the authentic experience he promised in his advertising, only to be met with the contempt of employees who considered themselves superior? But who would approach to serve him at that forgotten table and forever change the course of his life? "Oh, I don't believe it," murmured Isabella Izzy Flores as she saw she had been assigned the corner table. It was her first day covering the night shift at the Gilded Lily, after working 6 months on mornings only so she could take care of her brother Mateo in the afternoons. She desperately needed the extra tips, but she knew the corner tables never tipped well. Marcus always put the customers he considered small fry there. Students, construction workers, humble families who treated themselves to a meal out once a month. "This table is yours, Izzy," Marcus had said with that crooked smile she knew all too well. "I'm sure you and this customer will get along just fine." The mocking tone did not escape her. Marcus always made these derogatory comments about her humble background. Izzy came from a working-class neighborhood in New Orleans and had never hidden it. She was proud of her roots, of her hard-working family, of having gotten this far through sheer effort. But Marcus never missed an opportunity to remind her of it, as if it was something she should be ashamed of. Izzy approached the table with her best smile, the same one she used for all customers, no matter if the table was by the window or in the most forgotten corner of the place. "Good evening. Welcome to the Gilded Lily," she said with genuine warmth, looking directly into the eyes of the man sitting there. Julian looked up from the menu and was speechless for a moment. The woman before him was beautiful, but it wasn't the artificial, perfect beauty he was accustomed to in his social circle. It was a natural, authentic beauty, reflected more in her sincere smile and expressive eyes than in any physical feature. She had dark brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail, light brown skin that spoke of her Latin roots, and honey-colored eyes that shone with a light he hadn't seen in a long time. "Thank you," he managed to say finally. "I'm very happy to be here." And surprisingly, it was true. For the first time in months, he felt genuinely glad to be somewhere. "Is this your first time at our restaurant?" Izzy asked, as she poured water into his glass, noticing that the man seemed to be observing everything with particular attention. There was something about him that seemed familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. Perhaps it was the way he looked at the place, as if he were evaluating every detail, every sound, every aroma. Or maybe it was the way his eyes hardened when Marcus walked past their table without even greeting him. "Not exactly," Julian answered carefully, "but it's the first time that I've come like this, alone." It was a strange answer, but Izzy didn't press further. She had learned to respect the privacy of customers, especially those who seemed to carry complicated stories. And this man definitely had a complicated story. You could see it in the way his shoulders carried a tension that didn't match his relaxed appearance. "Well, I'm glad you decided to come," she said sincerely. "Our shrimp po' boys are the best in all of New Orleans. Can I recommend something special?" Julian ordered the shrimp po' boy on house-made bread, a side of red beans and rice, and an ice-cold Coca-Cola. As Izzy took his order, He watched how other waiters attended to the important tables. They went to great lengths to explain each dish, recommended wines, and ensured nothing was amiss. But when Marcus came by on his rounds, he stopped at Julian's table with a look of clear annoyance. "Izzy," he called out loudly enough for other customers to hear, "make sure this gentleman pays before you serve the food. You know how some customers are." The humiliation was intentional and public. Several customers turned to look at the scene, and Julian felt his blood boil. He had built this restaurant on the principles of respect and dignity for all, and his own manager was trampling on those values right in front of him. But what hurt him most was seeing the look of shame on Izzy's face. She lowered her gaze, clearly accustomed to this kind of humiliation from Marcus. "Don't worry about it," Izzy murmured to Julian once Marcus had walked away. "He's like that with everyone. Don't take it personally." But Julian did take it personally, very personally, not just because of the disrespect toward him, but because of the way Marcus treated Izzy. He had noticed the tension in her shoulders when her boss approached, the way she cast her eyes down, as if she were used to receiving humiliating orders. "Does he always treat you like that?" Julian asked, unable to contain his indignation. Izzy looked at him, surprised by the direct question. Most customers pretended not to notice such uncomfortable situations. "Oh, don't you worry about it, sir," she replied with a forced smile. "I'll go get your sandwich. It'll be ready in just a few minutes." She hurried off toward the kitchen, but Julian could see that her hands were trembling slightly. There was something deeper going on here, something that went beyond a rude boss and his employees. There was fear in those honey-colored eyes, real fear, but what Julian didn't know was that Izzy would return to his table with more than just a sandwich, something that would leave him completely paralyzed. Give this a like if you want to know what's in that mysterious note. Izzy returned to the table, expertly balancing the plate with the steaming po' boy in one hand and an icy Coca-Cola in the other. Julian could immediately smell the aroma of the perfectly seasoned shrimp, the freshly baked French bread, and the red beans that were the house specialty. But there was something different in the way Izzy placed the plate in front of him. Her movements were quicker than usual. Her eyes darted nervously in Marcus's direction, and her fingers trembled slightly as she placed the napkin next to the plate. "Here's your sandwich, sir," she said in a seemingly normal voice, but Julian caught a tone of urgency that wasn't there before. "It's fresh out of the kitchen, just as I promised." As she spoke, she discreetly slid something under the napkin. It was a movement so subtle that any other customer would have missed it, but Julian was watching every detail. "Enjoy," Izzy added, and for a second her eyes met his. In that gaze there was a mixture of pleading and desperation that sent a chill down his spine. Julian waited until Izzy had moved away to carefully lift the napkin. Underneath, there was a small piece of paper folded several times, the size of a bus ticket. His hands shook as he unfolded it, wondering what could be so important that a waitress would risk passing a secret note to an unknown customer. The letters were handwritten in blue ink, in a neat but rushed script, as if written in hiding. "The manager Marcus is stealing. He changes prices in the system, pockets tip money, and threatens the staff. I have proof, but he says if I talk, he'll hurt my brother, Matteo. I don't know what to do. If you know someone important, please help us. I." Julian read the note 3 times, each word feeling like a punch to the gut. His worst suspicions were being confirmed in the most painful way possible. His manager was not only stealing, but also using threats against his employees' families to keep them silent. The paper crumpled in his fingers as the reality hit him like a tidal wave. It wasn't just his restaurant being robbed. It wasn't just his money being stolen. This was something much worse. Marcus was destroying everything Julian had worked for: the trust, the respect, the dignity of his employees. He was turning the Gilded Lily into the exact opposite of what Julian had dreamed of when he opened it. His vision was to create a place where both customers and employees felt valued and respected, where family traditions were honored, where money was important, but never more important than people. And Marcus had taken that beautiful vision and corrupted it completely. Julian looked over to where Izzy was, now attending to another table with the same professional smile, and realized she had no idea who he really was. To her, he was just an ordinary customer who might, just might, be able to help her. She had trusted a complete stranger because she had no one else to turn to. Julian tucked the note into his shirt pocket, directly over his heart, and tried to eat the sandwich that now tasted like cardboard. Every bite was hard to swallow as he discreetly watched Marcus move through the restaurant as if he owned the place. He saw him approach the cash register when the operator was distracted. He saw him intercept a waiter returning with tips. He saw him speak to Izzy with an expression that boded no good. Marcus approached her as she was clearing an empty table and whispered something in her ear that made her turn pale. Julian couldn't hear the words, but he saw how Izzy's shoulders tensed and how her hands froze on the table's surface. Marcus smiled with satisfaction and walked away, leaving Izzy standing there, motionless, with a lost look in her eyes. Julian felt a fury he hadn't experienced in years, a primal anger that rose from the depths of his soul. That man wasn't just stealing his money, he was terrorizing an innocent woman who was only trying to make an honest living. When Izzy returned to ask if everything was all right with his food, Julian looked her directly in the eyes and said in a low voice, "I got your message." He saw her eyes widen with surprise and fear. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir," she muttered quickly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "It's okay," Julian said in the softest voice he could manage. "I want to help you, but I need to know more." Izzy shook her head, clearly terrified. "I can't talk here," she whispered. "He's watching us." Julian followed her gaze and indeed saw Marcus watching them from the bar, his eyes narrowed with a suspicious expression. "Where can we talk?" Julian asked urgently. Izzy hesitated for a moment, clearly debating internally whether she could trust this stranger. "At City Park, tomorrow at 8 p.m, by the main fountain," she finally murmured. "But if this is a trap—" "It's not a trap," Julian assured her. "I swear on my mother." It was a sacred promise, and Izzy seemed to relax slightly upon hearing it. But what neither of them knew was that Marcus had read their lips from a distance and was already planning his revenge. The New Orleans night had arrived with its characteristic October humidity, and City Park was illuminated by lights that cast golden reflections on the main fountain. Julian arrived 15 minutes early, dressed again in simple clothes, but this time he wore a sweater that had belonged to his father. It was an item of no monetary value, but it was full of memories, and for some reason he felt it would help him connect better with Izzy. He sat on one of the benches surrounding the fountain, watching families stroll with their children, young couples holding hands, grandparents feeding the ducks. This was real life, the life of the people who worked in his restaurants, the life he had lost somewhere between executive meetings and financial reports. At exactly 8 o'clock, he saw Izzy walking toward him with nervous steps. She wore a pale pink sweater that enhanced the golden tone of her skin, and her loose hair moved gently in the night breeze. But what Julian noticed most was the look of absolute terror on her face. It wasn't just nervousness about meeting a stranger, it was deep, visceral fear. "Thank you for coming," Julian said, standing up as she reached the bench. "I wasn't sure if you'd dare." Izzy sat at the opposite end of the bench, maintaining a cautious distance. "I shouldn't be here," she murmured. "If Marcus finds out—" "What would he do?" Julian asked, though he feared the answer. Izzy closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to speak. "You don't understand," she finally said. "Marcus isn't just my boss. He knows dangerous people, people who can do real harm." Her words were like ice in Julian's veins. His restaurant wasn't just being robbed by a dishonest employee, it was being used as a base of operations for something much more sinister. "Tell me everything," he requested in a soft but firm voice. "From the beginning." Izzy looked him in the eyes for a long moment, as if assessing whether she could truly trust him. Finally, something in Julian's expression convinced her. "It started 6 months ago," Izzy began, her voice trembling. "My brother, Matteo, got sick. He has leukemia and needs very expensive treatments that our insurance doesn't fully cover. I was only working part-time at the restaurant, but I needed more money, so I asked Marcus if I could work more hours." Julian felt his heart ache. He knew this situation all too well. The American healthcare system could be brutal, and for complex diseases like cancer, families often had to choose between bankruptcy or losing a loved one. "Marcus told me he could give me more shifts, but I would have to cooperate with him. At first, I thought he meant working overtime without extra pay, and I agreed because I needed the job." Izzy paused, wiping away a tear that had begun to roll down her cheek. "But then I realized that cooperating meant keeping my mouth shut about the things he was doing." The things he was doing. Julian felt nauseous, imagining what she was referring to. "What kind of things?" he asked, though a part of him didn't want to know. "At first it was small things," Izzy continued. "He would change the prices in the system after customers paid and keep the difference, or pocket credit card tips that he never gave us. I thought, well, it's theft, but it's not my problem, right?" Julian nodded, understanding that logic perfectly. When you desperately need money to save a loved one, it's easy to convince yourself that other people's problems are not your responsibility. "But then things got worse," Izzy went on, her voice cracking slightly. "He started bringing strange people to the restaurant after closing time, men who didn't look like normal customers, and he would make me stay to serve them, even though we were officially closed." Julian felt his blood run cold. His beautiful restaurant, his dream come true, was being used for activities he didn't even want to imagine. "What kind of men?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Men with tattoos, with gold chains, with very expensive cars but license plates that changed constantly," Izzy described, her voice growing quieter. "They talked about shipments, territories, things I didn't understand, but that sounded very dangerous. And Marcus acted like he was their boss when they were there." Julian clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. His restaurant was being used as a meeting point for drug traffickers or some other type of criminals. Everything he had built, his entire legacy, was being corrupted in the most horrible way possible. "Is that why you can't report him?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "One day, he saw me taking pictures of the documents where he was changing the prices," Izzy explained. "He grabbed my arm so hard it left a bruise and told me that if I talked to anyone about what was happening at the restaurant, his friends would pay Matteo a visit at the hospital." Her eyes filled with tears again. "My brother is 17, sir. He's so weak from the chemotherapy he can barely get out of bed. And Marcus showed me pictures of Matteo sleeping in his hospital room. Pictures someone took without anyone noticing." Izzy covered her face with her hands and began to sob silently. Julian felt a mixture of fury and compassion that threatened to overwhelm him completely. This brave, beautiful woman was being terrorized to protect criminals who were using his restaurant. And the worst part was that he, as the owner, was responsible for having hired Marcus, for not having supervised him better, for having allowed this to go so far. "Izzy," he said softly, moving a little closer to her on the bench. "Trust me." She looked up, her eyes red but with a spark of hope. "Why would a stranger help me?" she asked. "What do you gain by getting into such big trouble?" It was a valid question, and Julian knew he couldn't answer it completely without revealing his identity, but there was something he could say. Because what's happening is wrong, he said with absolute conviction, and because you deserve to live without fear. But what Julian didn't know was that, as they talked in City Park, Marcus was making a call that would change everything. "Boss, we have a problem. The waitress is talking to someone. I think we need to send a message. Do you think Izzy will be able to trust Julian completely? Comment what you would do in her place." 3 days after their meeting in the park, Julian returned to the Gilded Lily, but this time with a completely different plan. He dressed like a construction worker who had just finished his shift, cement-stained overalls, worn-out boots, and a New Orleans Saints cap he had bought at a street stall. He even dirtied his fingernails and let a 3-day beard grow to look more authentic. When he entered the restaurant at 6 p.m., the busiest time, Marcus barely glanced at him. It was exactly what Julian had hoped for. To Marcus, manual laborers were invisible. They deserved neither his attention nor his respect. Izzy was busy serving a table of businessmen when she saw him walk in. For a moment, their eyes met, and Julian could see the flicker of recognition, immediately followed by concern. He gave her an almost imperceptible signal to stay calm and act normally. He needed to observe Marcus's operations without raising suspicion, and the best way to do that was to become the kind of customer Marcus completely ignored. He was assigned the same corner table, and this time Julian was grateful for it. For the next 2 hours, Julian watched and took mental notes of everything that happened. He saw how Marcus intercepted cash tips left by customers, stuffing them into his pocket when he thought no one was looking. He saw how he altered bills in the system, adding drinks or desserts that had never been ordered. He saw how he treated the staff with contempt, especially the waiters who came from humble neighborhoods like Izzy. But what hurt him most was seeing how Izzy tensed up every time Marcus approached her. The way she lowered her gaze, how she flinched slightly, how her hands trembled when he spoke to her. Julian had seen this same reaction in women who had suffered abuse, and realized that Marcus wasn't just blackmailing her with threats against her brother. He was intimidating her in ways that likely went beyond the professional. When Izzy finally made it to his table, Julian could see she had deep, dark circles under her eyes, as if she hadn't slept in days. "How's Mateo?" he asked in a low voice as she poured his water. Izzy froze for a moment, surprised that he would ask about her brother. "How did you know?" she began to ask, but Julian gently cut her off. "You told me the other day, remember?" he said with a reassuring smile. "I just want to know how he is." Izzy's eyes welled up with tears, but she managed to hold them back. He's getting worse," she murmured. "The doctors say he needs a more aggressive treatment, but it costs a lot of money." Julian felt his heart break. Here was a woman working tirelessly to save her brother, being abused and threatened by her boss, and he had the power to solve it all with a single call to his bank. But if he revealed his identity now, would she trust that his intentions were genuine, or would she think it had all been a manipulation from the start? "Can I ask you something personal?" Julian said after a moment. Izzy nodded nervously. "What would you do if someone offered you real help? Not free money, but an opportunity to completely change your situation?" Izzy looked at him with a mixture of hope and suspicion. "Why are you asking me that?" she countered with another question. "Because I believe you deserve better than to live in fear," Julian said with complete sincerity. "And because there are people in this world who care about doing the right thing." It was a dangerous conversation to have in the restaurant, but Julian couldn't help it. Every minute he spent watching Marcus abuse his authority, every second he saw Izzy suffer in silence, brought him closer to the decision to reveal everything. "You talk as if you know these people," Izzy observed shrewdly. "How do I know you're not just another Marcus trying to take advantage of me when I'm vulnerable?" It was a smart and justified question, and Julian respected her for asking it. "You don't," he admitted honestly, You can only trust your gut. What does your heart tell you about me? Izzy studied him for a long moment, as if she were reading his soul through his eyes. My heart says you're different, she finally murmured. But my head says I'm a fool for trusting strangers. Julian pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and quickly wrote down his phone number. This is my number, he said, sliding the paper toward her discreetly. If you ever need urgent help, call me, no matter the time. Izzy took the paper with trembling hands. Why would you do this for me? She asked. You don't even know me. Julian thought carefully about his answer. He couldn't say he was the owner of the restaurant, but he could tell a deeper truth. Because I know a good person when I see one, he finally said, and because I believe good people deserve to have someone fight for them. At that moment, Marcus suddenly appeared beside their table. Izzy, he said in a harsh voice, why are you chatting so much with the customers? You have other tables waiting. The message was clear. Get away from Julian immediately. Izzy stood up quickly, but before she left, she murmured something only he could hear. Be very careful. Marcus has been asking questions about you. That night, Julian couldn't sleep, thinking about Izzy's words and the way her eyes had lit up when he offered her help. The following week, Julian settled into a routine that became an obsession. Every day, he visited the restaurant in a different disguise, always requesting that Izzy serve him. One day he would arrive as an electrician, another as an accountant for a small firm, another as a primary school teacher. Each persona allowed him to observe different aspects of Marcus's criminal operations, but if he were honest with himself, that was no longer his primary motivation. What truly brought him back every day was the opportunity to talk to Izzy, to see her smile when she recognized him despite his disguises, to feel that connection that grew stronger with each encounter. He had never experienced anything like it. A woman who saw him for who he was on the inside, not for his bank account or his social status. Izzy began to expect him, instinctively saving the corner table for him when she saw him arrive, making up excuses to spend more time talking with him. My favorite customer has arrived, she would sometimes whisper as she approached his table. And those simple words made Julian feel more valued than all the million-dollar contracts he had signed in his life. How's Matteo today? Became the first question Julian asked whenever Izzy came to his table, and she began to share increasingly intimate details with him. How Matteo worried about her, how he sometimes pretended to feel better so as not to distress her, how he read engineering books because he dreamed of building bridges one day. He's so smart, Izzy would say with sisterly pride. Much smarter than me. Before he got sick, he had a scholarship to study at Tulane. Julian listened to every word, memorizing every detail, feeling his heart fill not only with love for Izzy, but also with affection for a young man he had never met, but already considered important, simply because he was important to her. I'd love to meet him someday, Julian said one afternoon, and he saw Izzy's eyes light up with a happiness he hadn't seen before. He'd like to meet you too, she replied. I've told him about you. The thought that Izzy spoke of him to her brother made Julian feel a warmth that had nothing to do with the New Orleans weather. The conversations between them evolved from cautious exchanges to deep confidences. Izzy told him about her childhood, about how her mother worked cleaning houses to support the family after her father abandoned them. My mother died 3 years ago from lung cancer, she confided one afternoon. And I promised her I would never let Matteo suffer alone the way she did. Julian, in turn, shared carefully edited memories of his own life. He spoke of his love for New Orleans, of how he missed the simple times with his family before everything became complicated, of how he sometimes felt trapped in a life he hadn't fully chosen. He couldn't tell her the whole truth, but every word he shared was authentic. Do you have family? Izzy asked one afternoon. I have parents, Julian replied, but it's been a long time since we've had a real conversation. It's always about work, about expectations, about keeping up appearances. It was a simplified version of the truth, but it perfectly captured how he felt. Small gestures began to appear naturally between them, like wildflowers growing unplanted. Julian always left generous tips, but he would wrap them in little notes that said things like, "For Mateo's treatment," or "Because you deserve something beautiful." Izzy, for her part, started serving him extra-large portions, making sure his Coca-Cola was always ice-cold, bringing him extra freshly baked bread because the chef made too much. They were sweet lies that both understood as small declarations of affection. One day, Julian arrived with a scratch on his hand from fixing something at home. Izzy immediately brought him alcohol and a bandage, without him asking. "You can't be walking around hurt," she said, as she tended to the wound with a tenderness that made him feel more cared for than ever before. "Who's going to take care of me if you get hurt?" was a question that sounded like a joke, but their eyes said it was anything but. The looks between them became a secret language. When Marcus passed by and Izzy tensed up, Julian would reassure her with just a look, as if to say, "I'm here, you're not alone." When Julian seemed worried about something related to work or family, Izzy would give him that special smile she had, as if reminding him that there were good things in the world. One day, as she was serving him coffee, their hands accidentally touched, and neither of them pulled away immediately. It was only for a second, but in that second, Julian felt an electric current run through his entire body. "Sorry," Izzy murmured, but her blushing cheeks told him she had felt the same. "Don't be sorry," Julian replied softly. "Never be sorry for making someone feel alive." It was a dangerous, intimate declaration that crossed the line between friendship and something deeper, but neither of them regretted saying or hearing it. One afternoon, while Julian was waiting for his food, Izzy sat down across from him for the first time, taking advantage of the fact that Marcus had left to run some mysterious errands. "Can I ask you something?" she said, nervously fidgeting with the hem of her apron. "Why do you come here every day? And don't tell me it's just for the po' boys." Julian smiled, knowing the moment had come to be as honest as possible without revealing the whole truth. "I come for you," he admitted simply. "Because in all the places I've been, with all the people I've met, I've never found someone who makes me feel so real." Izzy looked at him with shining eyes. "Real," she repeated. "Yes," Julian confirmed, "like I can be myself without pretending to be someone else." It was ironic, considering he was technically pretending to be someone different every day, but deep down it was the purest truth he had spoken in years. "I feel the same way," Izzy whispered. "When you're here, I feel like I'm more than just a waitress trying to get by." But what neither of them knew was that Marcus had returned early from his errands and was watching them from the kitchen with a furious expression that boded no good. "We need to act fast," Julian murmured to Izzy as he pretended to review the menu he already knew by heart. It was a Thursday night, and the restaurant was quieter than usual, giving them a perfect opportunity to plan their next move. Marcus had been particularly aggressive in recent days, and both Julian and Izzy knew something bad was brewing. "He knows you're not a regular customer," Izzy whispered nervously, pouring water into his glass. "Yesterday, he asked me for your full name, where you worked, why you came so often. I had to make up that you were my cousin from Baton Rouge." Julian felt a pang of guilt for putting her in that position, but also admiration for her quick thinking. "Did he believe it?" he asked. "I'm not sure," Izzy admitted, "but he hasn't asked any more questions for now." Julian discreetly glanced over to where Marcus was, supervising the cash register with his usual suspicious expression. "We need that proof you mentioned in your note," he told Izzy. "The documents, the photos, everything you have." "They're hidden at my house," she replied, "but I can't get them out of there." Marcus has people watching where I live. The revelation that Marcus was keeping Izzy under surveillance made Julian feel a cold, calculated fury. This had gone too far. His employee was not only stealing and using the restaurant for criminal activities, but also harassing and threatening an innocent woman in her own home. "What kind of surveillance?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "A car that comes and goes," Izzy explained. "Different cars, but always with the same men. And sometimes I see someone standing on my street corner when I leave early for work." Julian nodded, quickly processing the options. As a millionaire, he had access to resources Izzy couldn't even imagine. Private investigators, lawyers specializing in organized crime, police contacts who could handle this kind of delicate situation. But using any of those resources would immediately reveal his true identity. "Do you trust me?" he asked her directly. Izzy looked him in the eyes for a long moment. "With my life," she answered without hesitation. "Then I need you to do exactly as I say." The plan Julian devised was risky, but necessary. Izzy would leave her house at the usual time for work, but instead of taking her usual bus, she would walk 2 extra blocks to a bakery Julian had researched the night before. There he would be waiting for her in a car borrowed from one of his trusted employees, and together they would go back to her house via a different route to retrieve the evidence, while the watchers would think she was on her way to the restaurant. "It's too dangerous," Izzy objected. "If they see us together, if they find out we're working together, they won't see us," Julian assured her with a confidence he didn't know where it came from. "And even if they did, it's about time someone stood up to Marcus." There was something different in Julian's voice, a natural authority that Izzy hadn't noticed before. For a moment, he sounded less like a concerned customer and more like someone accustomed to giving orders and making things happen. "Have you done this before?" she asked shrewdly. "What?" Julian replied, realizing he had shown more than he intended. "Planned things like this. Talked as if you know exactly what to do in dangerous situations." Julian hesitated for a moment. Every conversation with Izzy brought him closer to the moment he would have to reveal the truth, and every lie he told felt like a betrayal of the trust she had placed in him. "I've had to solve complicated problems before," he finally said, which was technically true without being a complete lie, "but never problems that mattered as much as this one." "Why does it matter so much?" Izzy asked. And Julian knew he had reached an emotional point of no return. "Because you matter," he replied with complete honesty. "Because Matteo matters. Because what Marcus is doing is wrong. And because someone has to do something about it." Izzy reached her hand across the table and briefly touched his. It was a small gesture, but it was charged with meaning. "No one has ever fought for me before," she murmured. Julian intertwined his fingers with hers for a moment before they both realized they were in public and quickly pulled apart. "Now I have," he replied, referring as much to fighting for someone as to having someone fight for him. The next day, the plan was executed perfectly. Julian waited in his personal secretary's blue Honda Civic, wearing a cap and sunglasses, as Izzy walked casually toward the bakery. Marcus's watchers followed their usual routine, positioning themselves to observe the bus stop she would never use. When Izzy got into Julian's car, he could see the mix of fear and determination in her expression. "Are you sure about this?" he asked one last time. "More sure than ever," she replied. Izzy's house was a modest building on a cobblestone street with pots of red geraniums in the window that spoke of the care with which she maintained her home despite the circumstances. "The evidence is in a box under my bed," she explained as she opened the door. "Photos, documents, even audio recordings I made on my phone when he was talking to those people." Julian followed her inside, immediately noticing the details that spoke of Izzy's economic reality. Old but impeccably clean furniture, family photos in cheap frames, a small television that was probably 10 years old. In Izzy's room, as she pulled a shoebox from under the bed, Julian saw a photograph on the nightstand that made him stop in his tracks. It was Izzy with a skinny 17-year-old boy, both smiling in what looked like the French Quarter. The resemblance between the siblings was striking. The same honey-colored eyes, the same warm smile, the same expression of genuine kindness. "That's Matteo," Izzy said, noticing Julian looking at the photo. "That was taken the day before he started chemotherapy. It was his 17th birthday. Julian felt something break inside his chest. That boy, that kid fighting cancer, was real. He wasn't just a sad story Izzy had told him, but a real person with real dreams who needed real help. And he had the power to provide it immediately. "Izzy," he said, his voice trembling, "I need to tell you something." But before he could continue, the sound of cars screeching to a halt outside made them freeze. "They found us," Izzy whispered, terrified, and Julian knew the time for revelations was over. "Stay back," Julian ordered Izzy with an authority she had never heard in his voice before. He moved to the window and saw 3 black cars parked outside the house, filled with men who were clearly not from the neighborhood. Marcus got out of the middle car, talking on his phone with agitated gestures, pointing at the house. "How many exits are there?" Julian asked quickly, and Izzy was surprised by the calm with which he seemed to be assessing the situation. "The front door, the back door that leads to the yard, and a window in the kitchen," she answered, trembling. Julian took out his cell phone and dialed a number Izzy couldn't see. "This is Julian Devereaux," he said in a firm voice. "I need security teams in the 9th Ward immediately. 234 Morelos Street. It's an emergency." Izzy stared at him with wide eyes, slowly processing what she had just heard. "Julian Devereaux," she repeated in a whisper. "As in Devereaux Restaurants. As in the owner of the Gilded Lily," Julian finished, turning to face her with a mix of determination and terror in his eyes. "Yes, Izzy. I'm the owner of the restaurant where you work." Izzy's world tilted as if an earthquake had struck. Everything began to make sense in the most painful way possible. The familiarity with which Julian observed the restaurant, the way he knew every detail of the menu, his confidence in making promises of help, his knowledge of how to handle crisis situations. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice cracking. "How long have you known about Marcus?" "Since the first day," Julian admitted, and he saw tears begin to form in her eyes. "I went to the restaurant because I suspected something was wrong, but I didn't know how wrong until you gave me that note." "So it was all a lie," Izzy murmured, taking a step back. "This whole time you knew who I was, where I worked, how much money I made. You got close to me as part of your investigation." "No!" Julian exclaimed desperately. "It didn't happen like that. Yes, I went there to investigate, but everything I feel for you, everything we've shared, that's real. More real than anything I've ever experienced in my life." Outside, banging on the front door began, accompanied by Marcus's voice shouting, "Izzy, I know you're in there. Come out now." "How can I believe anything you say?" Izzy asked, tears streaming down her face. "You're a millionaire. To you, I'm nothing more than a poor employee who caused you trouble." Julian felt those words pierce his heart like daggers. "Listen to me," he said, gently taking her by the shoulders. "Everything in my life was fake until I met you. The people who surround me, who smile when they see me, who tell me I'm wonderful, they're all there for my money. You are the first person in years who saw me as a man before you knew I was a millionaire." The banging on the door intensified, and they heard the sound of someone trying to force the lock. "When you took care of the scratch on my hand," Julian continued urgently, "when you asked about my family, when you worried because I looked sad, none of that was because you knew I was rich." Izzy slowly shook her head. "No," she admitted. I felt something special for you from the very first day, when I didn't even know your full name. Then believe in that, Julian pleaded. Believe in what we both felt, not in the circumstances that brought us here. The sound of the front door being kicked in made them react immediately. Out the back, Julian ordered, grabbing the box of evidence with one hand and Izzy's hand with the other. They ran to the back of the house as they heard the heavy boots of several men entering through the front. Search every room, Marcus's voice yelled. Find those documents. In the backyard, Julian helped Izzy jump over the low fence that separated her house from her neighbors, an elderly man who was watering his plants and looked at them in surprise. Mr. Aurelio, Izzy shouted, call the police, please. The old man nodded immediately and rushed inside his house. Julian and Izzy ran down the alley behind the houses, hearing shouts and the sound of things being destroyed in her home. My house, Izzy murmured in anguish. They're destroying my house. We'll fix it, Julian promised. I'll buy you a new house if necessary. I don't want you to buy me anything, Izzy exclaimed, stopping abruptly. Don't you see? That's exactly the problem. Julian stopped too, realizing he had said the worst possible thing at that moment. I'm sorry, he said immediately. I didn't mean it like that. I meant I'll do whatever it takes to help you, but in the way you want, not the way I impose. Izzy looked at him with an expression of deep pain. Do you know the difference between you and Marcus? She asked, her voice trembling. Julian shook his head, dreading the answer. Marcus uses his power to hurt people, Izzy said, but you use your power to control people. Maybe with good intentions, but it's still control. The words were like a slap in the face to Julian, because he knew they contained a truth. All his life, he had solved problems with money, helped people with money, shown love with money. He had never learned to just be there for someone without trying to fix everything. You're right, he finally admitted. But I want to learn. I want to learn to be the man you deserve, not the man I have to be because of my last name or my bank account. In the distance, police sirens began to wail, approaching quickly. If you really love me, Izzy said, looking him directly in the eyes, then prove it by being honest with me from now on. No more lies, no more secrets, no more games. Julian nodded solemnly. I promise, he said. But first, let me tell you something I should have said from the beginning. He moved closer to her, taking her hands in his. I fell in love with you when I saw you take care of that customer at the corner table with the same kindness you gave to the customers at the important tables. I fell in love with your strength when you told me about Matteo. I fell in love with your courage when you decided to trust me with that note, despite the danger. And I fell in love with your heart when you worried about me without knowing who I really was. Tears were streaming down both their faces now. But what hurts the most, Julian continued, is knowing that I might have lost the chance for you to fall in love with the real me because I never gave you the opportunity to meet him. But what Julian didn't know was that Izzy had a confession of her own that would change everything he thought he knew about their story. Will Izzy be able to forgive Julian? Julian, Izzy said softly, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. I have something to confess to. The police sirens were getting louder, but at that moment, standing in the alley behind the houses, the world had shrunk to just the two of them. Julian looked at her with a mixture of hope and terror, wondering what else could possibly change in a conversation that had already upended everything he believed about their relationship. Since the second day you came to the restaurant, Izzy continued, I knew exactly who you were. Julian felt the ground disappear from under his feet. What? He murmured, certain he had misheard. You knew? My brother Matteo is very smart, Izzy explained with a sad smile. And when I told him about this mysterious customer who came in every day with different disguises, he told me, "Izzy, look up Julian Devereaux, the restaurant owner, on the internet." And there was your picture. Julian stood completely still, slowly processing the magnitude of what he had just heard. All this time, while he had been worrying about her reaction to discovering his identity, she had already known and had chosen to play along. "But why?" Julian asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why did you pretend not to know? Why didn't you say anything?" Izzy took a step closer to him, and for the first time since they had fled her house, Julian saw tenderness instead of pain in her eyes. "Because I realized something very important," she said. "You weren't acting like the millionaire Julian Devereaux when you were with me. You were acting like Leo, the man who worried about my brother, who asked me how I had slept, who looked out for me when Marcus yelled at me." Leo. No one had called him Leo since he was a child, and his grandmother used to. Hearing that name from Izzy's lips was like receiving a hug after years of cold. "I understood that you were pretending too," Izzy continued, "but you weren't pretending to be someone better than you were, but rather pretending to be someone simpler. And that made me realize that maybe, for the first time in your life, you wanted someone to know you for who you really are, not for what you have." Julian felt tears streaming down his face. Tears of relief and gratitude, so profound, he had no words to express them. "So, when you told me you trusted me," Julian began to ask. "I trusted Leo," Izzy interrupted gently. "The man who sat at the corner table and made me feel like I was the most important person in the world. The man who promised to help me without knowing if I could give him anything in return. And when you said you were falling in love," Julian continued, barely daring to complete the question. "I fell in love with Leo," Izzy confirmed, "but also with the courage of Julian Devereaux to give up all his comfort to find out the truth. I fell in love with the man who had so much money he could have solved everything with a phone call, but who chose to sit with me on that bench in City Park and listen to my story. At that moment, police cars turned down the alley, their red and blue lights flashing against the walls of the houses. But before they arrived, Julian took Izzy's face in his hands. "Can you forgive me for not trusting you from the beginning?" he asked. "Can you give me another chance to be honest?" Izzy smiled, and it was the most beautiful smile Julian had ever seen. "I already have," she replied. "I've been giving you one every day." The police officers ran toward them, but 3 black SUVs also arrived, with men in suits who were clearly not ordinary cops. "Mr. Devereaux," one of the men from the SUVs said, "we're the security team you requested. Marcus Thorne and his associates have been detained. We found evidence of money laundering and threats at the young lady's house." Julian nodded, but never let go of Izzy's hand. "What evidence?" he asked. "The documents the young lady had collected, plus what we found on the phones of the men we arrested," the security agent explained. "We have enough to prosecute them for fraud, money laundering, threats, and criminal conspiracy." It was exactly what Julian had hoped for, but he realized he no longer felt satisfied with just legal justice. He wanted something more, something money and lawyers couldn't buy. He wanted a future with the woman who stood beside him, holding his hand as she spoke to the police with a bravery that filled him with pride and admiration. "And what happens now?" Izzy asked, looking him directly in the eyes. "Now the most important thing happens," Julian replied. "Now I'm going to meet Matteo, and he's going to meet the man his sister fell in love with." 3 months later, Julian stood outside the New Orleans University Hospital, holding a bouquet of yellow flowers and a bag of po' boys from the Gilded Lily. But they were no longer the same sandwiches that were served when Marcus ran the place. Julian had implemented sweeping changes, a new manager who treated all employees with respect, higher wages, better health benefits, and a scholarship program for the workers' children. Izzy had been promoted to general supervisor, but more importantly, she had agreed to be his girlfriend officially, after weeks of real, honest dates where Julian showed up as himself, with no disguises or pretenses. "Nervous?" Izzy asked, coming up beside him after parking her new car, a gift she only accepted after Julian explained it was for security reasons, not to impress her. "Terribly nervous," Julian admitted. "What if he doesn't like me? What if he thinks I'm not good enough for his sister?" Izzy laughed, that musical sound that had become his favorite in the whole world. "Leo," she said, using the nickname that now only she was allowed to use. "He already adores you. He's been waiting to meet you ever since I told him the whole story." They went up to the 5th floor of the hospital, where Mateo Flores was in a private room that Julian had arranged, but which was officially assigned due to medical availability so as not to hurt Izzy's pride. When they entered the room, Julian saw the young man he had only known through photographs, but who already felt like family. Mateo was sitting up in bed, reading a book on structural engineering, and when he saw them enter, his face lit up with a smile identical to his sister's. "Leo!" he exclaimed with genuine excitement. "Finally! Izzy won't stop talking about you." Julian approached the bed, feeling surprisingly emotional. This 17-year-old boy had fought cancer with a strength that humbled Julian, and he had done it while worrying more about his sister's well-being than his own. "Mateo," Julian said, extending his hand. "It's an honor to finally meet you." Mateo ignored the outstretched hand and gave him a strong hug. "Thank you," he murmured in his ear. "Thank you for taking care of my sister and for giving me a chance to live. The doctors say the treatment is working perfectly," Izzy said with tears of happiness in her eyes. "In 6 months, Mateo will be able to go back to school and then on to college," Mateo added with determination. "I've already been accepted at Tulane to study civil engineering. I'm going to build bridges, just like I always dreamed." Julian felt a deep satisfaction, completely different from any business success he had ever experienced. This was the result of doing the right thing, of using his resources for something that truly mattered. But more than that, it was the result of having found a family that loved him for who he was, not for what he had. "I brought po' boys," Julian said, holding up the bag, "from our restaurant." "Our restaurant?" Izzy asked, raising an eyebrow. "Well," Julian replied with a shy smile, "I was thinking maybe you could be a partner. You know better than anyone what that place needs to be truly special." It was a business proposal, but they both knew it was much more than that. It was an invitation to build something together, to be true partners in life. They spent the afternoon in the hospital eating sandwiches, laughing and planning the future. Mateo talked about his study plans, Izzy shared her ideas for improving the restaurant, and Julian realized he had never been happier. When it was time to leave, Mateo stopped them at the door. "Leo," he said seriously, "there's something I want to ask you." Julian nodded, preparing himself for anything. "Are you going to marry my sister?" he asked directly. Julian looked at Izzy, who had turned bright red but was smiling. "If she'll have me," Julian answered honestly, "and when she's ready." "Well, you'd better treat her right," Mateo said with mock seriousness, "because even sick, I can still beat you up." The three of them laughed, and Julian knew he had found not only the love of his life, but also the family he had always wanted. That night, standing on the balcony of Julian's apartment overlooking the lights of New Orleans, Izzy leaned against his chest as they watched the city that had brought them together. "You know what the most incredible thing about this whole story is?" Izzy asked. "What?" Julian replied, breathing in the scent of her hair. "That you went to the restaurant in disguise to find out the truth about your employees," she said. "But what you really discovered was the truth about yourself." Julian held her tighter, knowing she was right. He had gone to the Gilded Lily as a distrustful millionaire and had found the man he truly wanted to be. A man capable of loving unconditionally, of fighting without expecting rewards, of being vulnerable without losing his strength. "I love you, Isabella Flores," he murmured against her hair. "I love you, Leo Devereaux," she replied, using the name that was just theirs. And in the city of New Orleans, under the stars that shone over the Mississippi River, a millionaire and a waitress wrote the ending to their love story, which was really just the beginning of everything to come. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe now and leave a like to show your support. Tell me in the comments how you felt.